Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Rare Cancers Facebook Live. I'm delighted this afternoon to welcome Professor Andrew Wilson, who is the chair of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Board. We're sitting here in a padded room at courtesy of Price Waterhouse, and we're very grateful to them for hosting us. And I think we'll get started with questions immediately, Andrew, if that's okay. And probably the question that I think is very important for patients, if you could explain the relationship between the Therapeutic Goods Administration, your Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, and the PBS, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme itself, and how it all works and how we get drugs to market.
Right, so that should only take us the first hour of the presentation, Richard. Look, we should just warn your audience that this is not pre-prepared. That Richard's got a series of questions here that he hasn't shared with me. So if I don't necessarily run totally coherently during this period of time, it's not because I'm trying to avoid the questions, but I actually will have to think of answers on the run and recall things as we go in relation to that. So apologies in advance if there's a little bit of stuttering during the presentation. Look, it's a really important question you asked. One of the things that always amazed me that this program, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, has been running for more than 60 years. It's a really core part of Medicare and access to services in Australia, and yet few of us really know how it all operates, and that sort of mystery there sometimes I think creates concerns. So it's important to remember that Australia is a relatively small pharmaceutical market in international terms. While we're a relatively wealthy country, we are in pharmaceutical terms a small part of what's there. So a lot of things that happen in our processes are determined by what happens in larger markets elsewhere that influence pharmaceutical companies in terms of what they do. So the first step is a pharmaceutical company has to make a decision that they think the Australian market is worth accessing, or that it's worth accessing for a particular segment of the patient population. And that's a decision which is made on the basis of both the marketing strategy of the company, but it also relates to the degree to which the drug has already been considered in other markets. So, we rarely get drugs presented to us in Australia before they've already been considered by the Federal Drug Administration in the US. The Food and Drug Administration in the US, or the European Medicines Authority in Europe. And so, in some ways, the drugs are fairly well positioned in the market by the time they get to us. The company puts in an application to the TGA. The drug has to be registered with the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia, and it will be registered for. The company will again choose what they will seek a registration for, and that may be quite a broad indication, or it may be for a relatively narrow indication. In the main, they'll choose to do that on where they have the strength of evidence, the strength of information for particular patient groups, and that sometimes creates problems later down the track, as I'm sure we'll talk about in that process. What has traditionally happened then is that after the Therapeutic Goods Administration has given an authority to sell the drug in Australia, then the company has makes an application to the PBAC for consideration of subsidy on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. I say that's the traditional approach because now with most new drugs we actually have a parallel processing approach, which means they make applications to us and to the TGA at the same time. Certainly for most new drug entities they're allowed to do that. And that has sped up the process of approval and consideration substantially in relation to that. The company makes. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the PBAC side of the PBS side of things, the pharmaceutical benefits side of it, because the TGA is a whole story in itself. And what happens then is the company makes an application. That application is based on some guidelines that we have for about that. They'll usually have a discussion with the department in advance of their application to say we're thinking about putting a drug in for this purpose for this population, and they'll get some guidance from the department about how they should go about doing it. That application comes in, it goes out to one of our evaluation groups. There are a series of these based around universities in Australia, where they scrutinise the claims that are made, the evidence and the basis for that claim. That evaluation is then provided back to the company. The company gets a chance to respond to that. We also, about that time, advertise the fact that we've got a submission, and clinicians and patients and anybody who's basically interested can then send in comments to us, and those comments are important to us, and we spend a significant amount of time compiling them. The reports, the evaluation reports and the comments, original application and all that material goes to our two principal subcommittees, Drug Utilisation Subcommittee, which looks at how widely the drug's likely to be used, and whether the patient group that has been proposed is the right patient group, and to our Economic Subcommittee, which obviously looks at the claims around the relative effectiveness, relative safety and the cost effectiveness of drug. And then that all goes back to the company for comment, so that there's a sort of trying to give everybody a fair chance here, and all that material comes to the PBAC for consideration, along with the compiled comments that have come in. Companies get to nominate a clinical expert, or in fact they can nominate anybody to come and talk to the PBAC as part of the hearing process. And we also have situations where we have patient hearings, particularly for new entity drugs, things which have never been used before. We'll meet with patient groups and try and understand their perspective on things in relation to that. And then, and then once we've made a decision about it, it may go backwards and forwards, then we make a recommendation to the government, to the minister, to list the drug. It then has to be listed, and there's a process that takes some time, which means that, the negotiations with the company about whatever conditions we may have placed on it, and just the process of getting the drug onto the PBS.
Right. Thank you. That's very comprehensive. Thank you. We might just go to some questions from patients. This first one's from Sarah, and I stress it's from Sarah, not from me. By definition, cancers that are rare have less data to prove efficacy of treatment. Does the PBAC take this into consideration when approving or declining drugs for rare cancers and rare diseases?
Thanks for that question, Sarah, and the answer is yes. It's important to remember that, as I sort of iterated before, we have to look at the relative effectiveness, the relative safety, and the relative cost effectiveness of the drug. But we do that on the basis of what data is available, and sometimes, and as you quite rightly make the point in your question, the ability to collect that data may be limited by the patient numbers. Although you'd be surprised at the clinical trials which have been conducted on very rare and very small patient groups. For example, in the budget there was an announcement about a new drug for children and with spinal muscular atrophy. I mean, this is a rare disease, probably rarer than most of the cancers we're talking about. But they were able to and organised a randomised controlled trial to get evidence around the effectiveness of that drug.
Fair enough, that's great. A question from Nicole. With regard to childhood cancers, does the PBAC ever consider the cost of not funding a new drug, including things like significant side effects of drugs designed for adults costing the public purse? I think the question is there a balance in questioning the consequence of not doing it? Yeah,
and Nicole, you put your finger on one of the most problematic areas we have. Many drugs are not trialled in children for good reasons, and well, depends on how you look at it. There are concerns about conducting trials in children, and so a lot of the time we're trying to extrapolate results from adult studies in adults to to what's happening in kids. This is problematic, comes back to that issue around the role of the TGA, because if the company has only applied for approval for a drug for use in adults, the drug may only be registered in Australia for use in adults, and depending on how that's defined. So it is one of the challenges for us. We try and take an approach which says, at the end of the day, the decision about whether to treat a child or treat somebody who falls outside, an age limit like that, is probably best left in the hands of the clinician. Or the clinician and the family obviously needs to be involved in weighing up that risk-benefit ratio. We can't always do that, because sometimes we obviously have some concerns about how the drug might work in children as well, because children are not small adults. Their bodies handle drugs in different ways, and their responses are not necessarily the same as what they are in adults. So we have a high index of concern. But our preference is because of this, is to sort of provide some sort of leeway in relation to that. But we certainly do consider this just about every application where there is an age limit which is being proposed.
Right, thank you. We are getting some questions coming through specifically directed towards specific drugs and specific conditions. We're not going to try and address them today, because it would be impossible for Andrew to be across every minute detail of everything on the fly. So we will come back privately to each of those questions and deal with them offline, but we will get responses and sort that out.
So Richard's not going to gently say that I don't know everything about every drug that's on the PBS. There are some 6,500 drugs listed on the PBS. Some of those drugs, particularly in areas like cancer, have very extensive restrictions, conditions which are applied how they list. They might stretch to, in some one that we looked at recently, there were 30 pages of instructions in relation to clinicians using that drug. And I just, being honest, I don't know, and I don't memorise all of those at once, but I'm more than happy to try and answer questions if they are specific questions about those restrictions.
Right. A question from Joanna. It's a fairly long question, but it's a good one. How do you decide which medicines to put up for approval? And we've kind of covered that, and what priority they receive in the approvals process. How are you able to take account of science-based approvals given in other countries with similar standards and processes to ours? How can the PBS make access to cancer medicines more fair so that it does not depend on where in the body the cancer is located? And what is the mean length of time for a drug to receive PBS approval, and how does that compare in other countries?
So, Joanna, we should have used your question as the opening question, because really that covers a lot of the issues, I'm sure, of interest to people online today. I'm going to have to get Richard to repeat some of that as we go, but let me start and try and do this. So, firstly, in relation to the extent that we can take into account experience elsewhere. So, just in terms of the registration process, certainly there is now scope within the registration, within the Therapeutic Goods Administration assessment, for them to take on board the assessments that have been made by what are called like-minded countries, so countries which have at least the same standard of regulation as we do. So, in principle, that's the US, Canada, and the EMA are the main ones in that regard. And that has been more formalised now, and will almost certainly lead to a range of drugs being registered much faster in relation to that. Unfortunately, we haven't got to the point yet where we have a basis for doing that for the PBAC considerations. There are a range of reasons for that. Part of it is that you have to consider the drug in context, that the way drugs are used or way the health systems are set up mean that drugs may have different cost effectiveness in different circumstances. Secondly, some of the information which is provided in the company applications is commercial in confidence. They don't like to disclose their prices in international markets because they have different prices in different settings, and so consequently, an analysis which has been done, let's say in Canada, based on a price which has been provided in Canada, might be quite different to what's being provided to us in Australia in terms of the price and therefore the relative cost effectiveness of that drug. So that's, but having said that, we are trying to look at ways that we can share this, and we certainly, where there is published information, the evaluation teams will always go and have a look to see whether there's a published evaluation from somewhere like the National Institute for Clinical Excellence in England, or CADITH, which is the equivalent organisation in Canada, that those can be quite informative to the process and help us understand where they are. In terms of prioritising one body part over another, we don't prioritise one body part over another, one cancer over another, and sometimes it may look like we do, but that's because we're a submission-driven process. So we don't initiate applications. The companies initiate applications to us, and in the rare situations where we get an application for a drug not from a company, so in the example there where Rare Cancers, for example, has initiated applications, that's great from our perspective because it's actually been initiated by according to a need, as opposed to according to a very different set of needs which might reflect what the company's interested in achieving in that regard. So, as I say, we don't prioritise. It reflects the way the submission process works in relation to that. Did I cover all of them?
Yep, I think you got it pretty much bang on. The next question is from Leah, and she's broadly asking the question around when drugs have dual purposes, but I think it leads into the broader question of the pan-tumour, the challenge that I think broadly the rare cancer community and sometimes the rare disease community feel that because it takes a separate application for each cancer type before a drug can be reimbursed, that puts not of your doing, but it means that rare cancers get pushed to the bottom of the line. And I know that you've initiated a meeting on August 17 to discuss this in terms of pan-tumour, but I wonder if you could talk broadly about that, what you hope to get there, and what do you see as the challenges and barriers to sort of multi-indication submissions?
Yeah, so again, this comes back to who initiates the application. There is nothing stopping a company now putting in an application for multiple tumours if they want. But they will have to present the evidence for those different tumours, or the different types of tumours as part of that application. But if they wanted to, they could. We would probably say, look, yes, we're happy to receive it, but just from a point of view of ease of examining it, let's separate them into different bundles, if you like. But there's nothing stopping them putting that forward. However, in most cases, that's not how drug development works. Usually there is a frontline indication that the company's chosen either because of marketing positioning or because that's where it looks most clinically fruitful. And so they will make a decision to proceed with the indication which looks like it's the best indication. That, for a company at one level, the worst thing that can happen for it is to fail its registration status. They don't want to have their drug seen as failing a registration process, so they're very cautious about what they will put forward in relation to this, and they will always come forward with their best foot. That is, where they've got the best evidence in relation to this. There are many drugs already listed that are used across different tumours. Across different tumours. That drugs which are used in different combinations already. So this is not an alien concept that there will be drugs which are used for different types of tumours. The difference at the moment is that we have a range of drugs which are all expensive and within patent, where people are looking to use those drugs in situations where we have very little or no evidence for their effectiveness in that situation. And so we can't meet our requirement to make a judgment as to whether or not the drug is cost effective in those situations. However, with the PD-L1 inhibitors, this sort of group, this class of drugs which are part of the class of drugs called immunotherapies, there are a very large number of tumours for which these drugs are being trialled, and I stress that there's still, most of those trials are not finished, so we don't know the answer. All we know is that they're being trialled in those situations, and I stress that what history shows is that for many of those indications that the drugs will be shown not to work for those particular indications. So the fact that trials are being conducted does not mean they work. But having said that, we're trying to anticipate that situation might arise. The Minister Hunt has asked us specifically to look at whether there might be a simplified approach that we can take to doing that, and we're about to release a paper to seek comments on that particular issue, and then in our August meeting we will look at that and provide advice to the Minister about whether we think we can do it. The challenge at this point in time, the biggest challenge from my perspective anyway, is that we have relatively limited information which has been provided to us. So despite the fact that I think we did a rough count, there were more than 200 trials going around the world at the moment for these sorts of drugs in different tumours, etc. We've only seen them for about about 4 tumours that we've seen them for so far. And we've seen them in very different settings, so sometimes in first line setting, sometimes in last line setting. We've seen them with and without a requirement for particular levels of markers. So when you divide that up among 4 tumours, you can see that our experience and understanding of these drugs is still very limited.
Now, I'm sort of looking through a lot of these questions, and they do have that same recurring theme, that because the cancers are rare, the evidence is scant, and hence we find ourselves trapped in this circumstance where it's not difficult but not impossible to get drugs listed. Do you see any potential for if you like provisional listings as opposed to provisional registration, whereby a drug might be made available in either a limited release or in some capacity subject to evidence being collected as we go? And does that look like something that could be feasible?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things to comment on one here. Firstly, you mentioned that you'd had Professor David Thomas on one of your earlier broadcasts, and I just want to put in a ringing endorsement for the investment that the government's made in trial infrastructure, clinical trial infrastructure, particularly in the cancer area, in particular in relation to rare cancers, and the work that David and other people are leading in this space to try and take a more systematic approach to collecting information, to collecting evidence around the effectiveness of drugs for rare cancers. So just putting in that plug, because I think it's a really important development, and one which in the longer term promises, I think, some way forward, which for people. The second thing is we already have situations where we have a process where there is further evidence collection as we go ahead. At present, PBAC does not have the capacity to have conditional listings. So I just need to make a distinction here. The TGA, under recently passed legislation, can now allows for the registration of a drug in Australia under what's called provisional conditional registration, which means they haven't got all the evidence in at present. The companies get a period of time but the drug looks promising. More importantly, there's a sense that the drug is relatively safe, and therefore they have registered the drug in anticipation that the company is going to bring forward further evidence of effectiveness at some point in the future. And the drug under that law is actually required to bring forward the evidence within a period of time, I think it's 2 years offhand, that they will have to bring forward that evidence, or the drug will be could potentially be deregistered at that point in time.
Right.
We do not have that, formally do not have that capacity. We can only make a recommendation to the Minister that the drug should be listed. We can make conditions under which it's listed, but those conditions are primarily related to defining the patient population, the patient group where we see the drug as being cost effective. Having said that, there are circumstances where we accept less than what we would think would be the ultimate information that we want to know. So there have been listings of drugs, for example, based on what we've seen in terms of the early results. So again, one of the cancer drugs that was featured in the budget is one where we will not know the effects on overall survival of that drug for at least another 2 to 3 years until their trials are finished.
Yep.
But the results that the company presented looked very promising in relation to that, and we reached an agreement to get a relatively early listing for that drug.
Great. The next question I have is from Andrew Warden, who runs a patient group called Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia, and I'm going to generalise the question because I think it's a really good question. And essentially, what he's saying is, what's the most constructive way that patients can contribute to your understanding of what's needed, what's out there, and how can they help the process? Is essentially the question.
Okay, so. Andrew, wasn't it?
Andrew.
Yeah, Andrew, thank you for that question. Waldenstrom's one of those conditions which, as a medical student, you hate to get in a viva because you know you're going to stumble over the words trying to get it out. And an important condition. The question you ask, I think, is a really important one, and this for us is one of the key elements of what we've been doing work on in recent times, because people develop expectations around drugs which are sometimes not reflected in the evidence which is presented to the committee, and that's it's not. We're not talking about the committee trying to be misled or anything. It's just that people interpret things in different ways. And we have been trying to better understand what patients' expectations are in relation to drugs. And this is particularly important when you have drugs which are not curative, and understanding what the benefits might be in those sort of circumstances. So one of the things I mentioned before is that we have patient hearings prior to before PBAC considers a drug, and one of the things that we do in that is we try and explore and understand what it is that patients, that people living with the lived experience of a disease, what they see as the risk benefits in particular therapies. What are they thinking they're going to get out of it? And what are the trade-offs that they might be prepared to accept between the adverse effects of a drug, and many of these drugs will have adverse effects because they're powerful drugs, and the benefits that they might accrue in relation to that. And as I say, particularly in the context of diseases where full cure is unlikely, and people are going to have to live with those sort of consequences. So that's an important development. The other work that the PBAC has two consumer representatives on it, and our subcommittees have consumer representatives on them. And but I mentioned before that we get these submissions from people around this information, and we might get none, we might get a few, and in some cases we'll get a few thousand submissions from people, depending on how much publicity it has, how much concern there is around in relation to it. A lot of that information is actually not particularly informative. It just says we think we would like to have access to this drug. We understand that, but what's more informative is when people start to go down to addressing those questions about why, what are you going to get out of this? What does it actually mean in terms of your quality of life, in terms of what you think might do that? And that helps us understand that threshold between what might be important and not. And led by Joe Watson, who's the deputy chair of the PBAC and one of the consumer reps, we're also trying to work with patient groups to try and systematise that information that we get, to get that information in a more systematic way. Other jurisdictions have done this, other countries have done this better than us so far, and we don't like that. Don't like to be second to anybody, and so we're looking at how we can do this differently. But the Canadians, for example, have spent are spending a lot of time and resources in working with patient groups to formalise the information which is provided to ensure that it is in a format that better informs our decision making. We have a framework in which we are legislatively required to work. And while we understand that anybody who sees a promising drug out there that might help the disease would like a subsidy for it, that's not the basis under which we make decisions. And so by through this process, we hope to have a more informed stream of information from patients and patient groups.
Great. This is the last question. The time's just flown. What development have you seen in the last 12 months that gives you the most hope?
I assume you don't mean on particular therapies.
No, just broadly around cancer treatment in this country.
No, look, I think there are a couple of things that I've already said and given my endorsement for the work, the investment that's been made from the Medical Research Future Fund into establishing better clinical trials capability in this country, and I think that has placed us on, it will place us in a very different footing. It'll place us on a different footing because we'll become a place where people want to trial drugs, and that's important in terms of giving patients the options of participating in trials. It gives us a capacity to, in the context of rare cancers and rare diseases more generally, to be able to actively engage with larger scales trials internationally, because for many rare diseases it's never going to be possible in a population of 20 million people, 25 million, we've grown, people to conduct some of these trials, and so we need to be part of those broader international studies, and I think we will also become very active in starting those studies, and we've already seen some examples of that. So I think that's a really important fundamental development which will have flow-on consequences both for registration and subsidy of drugs in relation to that. I think the notion of the conditional provisional registration in the TGA through the TGA process is important. It's good news for patients, providing we actually do ensure that companies follow through with their commitments to produce that data, so we do understand what the true nature of those drugs are. And there's going to be a challenge for us, and I mean, being absolutely upfront about it, there will be a challenge for the PBS, for the PBAC, and for us in terms of how we then deal with that, because it will generate expectations that we will do our work faster, and we're mindful of that, and we're trying to work that through.
Yeah, right. Look, thank you so much, Andrew. It's been brilliant. My personal observation is that your leadership in this space is peerless, and your availability and accessibility to people like us is extraordinary, and we're incredibly grateful. So thanks to you, and thanks to everybody out there who's watching. And as I said, any questions not answered, we'll follow up and get them back in the next few days. Cheers. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for inviting me.